start with Bellucci, Babe. I know she had a little bit of a disappointing run in a recent race, but a lot of favorites in that race were up in it by 101 shot. That's horse racing. But coming into that race, 6 wins in 22 career races, obviously a talented girl, talented filly. What makes her such a solid possibility for the Everest?
Yeah, well, definitely a big hiccup along the way, and I was expecting her to run a lot better than she did on Saturday, but she seems to have come through well. Her form in the autumn was very good. She was probably a little bit unlucky fourth in the Group 1 Galaxy over 1100, and then the best form race for any Everest every year is the TJ Smith Stakes, and she ran a super fourth there. She can handle all types of tracks. I think that's definitely in her favour. We're just going to get back on track now, so it's a bit of a question mark where we go and what we do. But on her day, she's shined. She's not far off the best of them.
Welcome back to the Everest Connections. I'm AP Harold, another special guest. It's our veteran horseman, Bjorn Baker out of Australia, via, of course, we'll get into that, New Zealand back in the day. And Bjorn, we appreciate your time, man.
Yeah, great to be on, AP. Looking forward to it. And yeah, racing, it just keeps getting ever smaller around the world. It
certainly does. Racing and technology and the money in the island continent for horse racing, it keeps going up. That's a lot of fun. We'll talk more about the Sportsbet Sydney Sprint Series. We're going to say that together 10 times in a row later in this interview to get all our S's in a row. But first, Bjorn, I want to start off with, you've got your training center there, Bjorn Baker Racing at Warwick Farm, and that's branded as where the country meets the city. A neat combination. Could you elaborate on both the setting and the facilities?
Yeah, I've been in at Warwick Farm now for about 11 years, and it's been great for me. I came over with 2 horses initially, and the centre really at the moment is super competitive. I'd say in terms of Australian racing, we probably have 3 or 4 of the biggest trainers, well, probably the 4 biggest trainers. You've got Godolphin, of course, James Cummings, Chris Waller's got a stable here. Kieran Maher and David Useless have got a stable here as well. And as well as that, you've got the young trainers like Annabelle Neesham, established trainers, Gary Portelli, of course, he's won the Golden Slipper last year. So it's highly competitive just at Warwick Farm without getting into Sydney racing as a whole. Of course, you've got Randwick and Rosehill with the other 2 main training centres, but Warwick Farm probably has probably 50% extra horses than what Rosehill and Randwick do. So it's definitely a competitive environment every day. You can't sit down and relax, and you've got to be on your game the whole time. It's very competitive.
No sitting in the sport of horse racing. The horses stand or they run. And Bjorn, you came there with 2 horses, 2 boxes. You've moved that up 46-fold. 46 times 2 is what, 92. That's an amazing measure of success. When you look back a little over a decade ago at that guy, what advice would you give to him today, your younger self?
It's hard to look back, and you're probably got to look forward. I probably would have said buy every street cry mare out of an Alec Bar, every street cry filly out of an Alec Bar mare. I might have ended up with Winks. Unfortunately, she was a superstar, but yeah, you can look back and think what would have been, but I think overall I've had an amazing time. I've met a lot of remarkable people, and I probably wouldn't change too much at all. It's been a great run, and I'm in a much better position than I could have ever hoped for.
Absolutely. And we'll talk more about that fantastic future and present, but I want to look a little bit further back. And your dad is a fantastic horseman, Murray Baker, in New Zealand. You grew up, some might say, in his shadow, and of course in a different country, but countries that are Canada and the States over here, that they're similar but different, of course. What was it early on that sparked your interest in the sport of kings?
Well, initially I grew up, and my father probably wasn't as well respected as he is now. He's had a lot of luck in Australia. He's the most probably winning Group 1 trainer to travel horses from New Zealand, where he is. And I think even he's retired now. He's just recently retired in May, and he had a remarkable time traveling horses to Australia. So he's very well respected over here. But I grew up initially. I wasn't too interested in terms of working with horses. I was more interested from a form point of view, breeding and probably gambling. So I was always very good at maths and
Run the numbers, baby.
Yeah, I like the numbers, and my sister was probably a lot more hands-on, but as time sort of developed, I had to work with the horses and I had to get involved. And at that stage, my father had a very, probably as a child, an up and down career like a lot of horse trainers do, and it wasn't always easy. But the last sort of 15, 20 years of his career, he had a remarkable run, and it was great to be involved. Even in Australia, a lot of his horses, when they came to Sydney, they'd stay with me. So it was great for our relationship, and I was able to learn a lot, and it worked very, very well for a number of years.
Bjorn, let's follow up on something. You mentioned that your dad had to work for it. It wasn't as respected, didn't have as much early success. Your story, as I did my research, you got into pharmacy for almost a decade. You were in the business world, and it looked like you were going to go off and do something more conventional. So you've had to earn your stripes a little bit later, even though you came from a racehorse background. So similar stories of guys who stuck with it to get the acclaim they deserve.
Yeah, it's sort of, well, the town I grew up with was a small sort of town called Woodville that had a great horse racing history. Unfortunately, it's pretty much gone as a horse racing establishment now. New Zealand racing is tough going at the best of times, and particularly for Woodville. So I was keen to move out of home, and I went to Otago University down the south of New Zealand and got a pharmacy degree, which was great. I lived in Sydney in my young 20s for 3.5 years, then 4 years in Europe. And I did a little bit of time with, spent a couple of mornings a week just free, and used to go down for experience to the Curragh with John Ox, and I was able to get around. But pharmacy was a good degree. It sort of obviously set you up with a good base and probably a little bit more of a business background, and good in terms of dealing with people from the very high end to the very bottom end. And sometimes racing can be a bit like that as well.
He's Bjorn Baker. I'm AP Harold. This is the Everest Connections, and let's turn our attention to a couple of Everest possibilities in your stable. Ladies first. Let's start with Bellucci, babe. I know she had a little bit of a disappointing run in a recent race, but a lot of favorites in that race were up in it by 101 shot. That's horse racing. But coming into that race, 6 wins in 22 career races. Obviously a talented girl, talented filly. What makes her such a solid possibility for the Everest?
Yeah, well, definitely a big hiccup along the way, and I was expecting her to run a lot better than she did on Saturday, but she seems to have come through well. Her form in the autumn was very good. She was probably a little bit unlucky 4th in the Group 1 Galaxy over 1100, and then the best form race for any Everest every year is the TJ Smith Stakes, and she ran a super 4th there. She can handle all types of tracks. I think that's definitely in her favour. We're just going to get back on track now, so it's a bit of a question mark where we go and what we do. But on her day, she's shown she's not far off the best of them.
And Bjorn, I see all the trophies behind you. You've had a lot of success, but anybody who's been in the business as long as you've had your disappointments, like the race the other day at the Missile Stakes with Bellucci, babe. What's your advice to young horsemen who suffer through that first big disappointment and start questioning themselves, whether it's a jockey or a trainer or even an owner?
Yeah, you have to be resilient, and you really have to figure out what works for you in terms of how you train a horse. Even at Warwick Farm, there's 45 different trainers here at Warwick Farm, and I think it's safe to say that all 45 train very differently. And so it's about finding what works for you, being resilient, and you have to back yourself. You have to take risks. You have to buy horses and get the right horses to start with. And in Sydney and Australia, I think I'm very biased, but I think week on week, even midweek to Saturday, our racing doesn't stop. I'd say week on week, our racing is probably as tough as it gets anywhere in the world. We get horses from all around the world here, American breeds, French, Irish, English, Japanese, South African, and of course, Kiwi horses. And it's very competitive. You need the right horses to compete, but essentially it's about what works for you.
It's a lot like, let's use a sport that's international, basketball. If a guy has a weird form on his shot, but he hits 55, 60%, you might not tell the little kids to shoot that way, but you tell him to keep shooting it that way. And I guess if you're a trainer and you've got something that works for you, doesn't work for somebody else, keep doing it, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's about what works. I'll take 50 or 60%. I'd actually take 16%. But No, it is. It's competitive racing, and it's just you've got to be tough. You've got to back yourself, and I think the key is if your horses are healthy, fit, and look good, they'll run well.
Let's talk about another horse in your stable that's a fantastic equine, Overpass. And that's raced by Derby Syndication, not to be confused with Derby, which is such a common word in our business, but Derby Syndication. What makes this horse so special?
Yeah, he's a horse that's just kept improving. He was unlucky in the spring of last year. Then first up, he won the Expressway Stakes, and he probably took a few people by surprise that day. Not so much me, but he went straight to the front. He held off a couple of really good horses, including Animo, who's one of the, if not, was the best 3-year-old of last season. So he's definitely got the form on the board. Once again, he ran through the autumn. He won a big English prize money race for 750,000 as well. And then he was a very unlucky 5th in the Galaxy Stakes. I think if he'd got clear room, he would have just about won that. It's, of course, over 1,100 and was very important in the scheme of things, him still being a colt. And then he ran 5th in the TJ Smith Stakes, which, as I alluded to, is a very good form race. And just, he might have been coming to the end of it that day. I think he's probably better on top of the ground as well. So a lot of our the weather in the last 6 months has had a massive impact on a lot of these horses. We've just had torrential rain that seems to have lasted forever.
Bjorn, you mentioned that Overpass did a great job of jumping to the front, and so many fantastic sprints in Australia. The Sportsbet Sydney Sprint Series, in fact, has just been announced. If we're talking about something like over here in the States, the Belmont Stakes, which is what, 1.5 miles, it's okay if you don't jump to the front right away. In fact, it's probably better if you don't. But in a sprint, pretty soon you need to make your move. As a trainer, how do you go about assessing the jockey and the horse combination, and when that particular horse, I guess the distance as well, some are 1,000 meters, some are 1,300 meters, but when your horse needs to make that move?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and you live and learn. All I'd say is if you look at the stats in Australian racing, the first 4 around the corner tend to get the chocolates most of the time. So a lot of it can be very much about being in the right position. And a lot of our tracks are fairly tight, not so much Randwick where the Everest is held and even Rose Hill, but a lot of the other tracks, you've got to be flexible and adaptable, and gate speed's a big part of it. You can win a lot of races in the first 50 meters, and likewise you can lose more by getting back.
Bjorn, let's jump into the nuts and bolts a little bit, not too much of the weeds, but the Sportsbet Sydney Sprint Series. I haven't asked Mr. Google about all the combinations of pounds, sterling, dollars, Hong Kong dollars. I don't even know those still exist. We've got euros and, of course, Australian dollars, but 30 million Australians, a lot of money, irrespective of who you are. This is a lot of fun. It's half a dozen races. They're going to give you points, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, reverse order, first through fifth finish, and then the last race, double points. How excited are you and your fellow trainers, jockeys, ownership, everybody about the Quadruple S, the Sportsbet Sydney Sprint Series?
Yeah, it's very, very exciting. It's a massive amount of money, no doubt about it. And a lot of these races, it's a little bit tricky too, because you can't be in all of them. I doubt very much, sort of, you're probably looking at 4 tops. So really you have to make it count. But yeah, I think yeah, the money is unbelievable, whatever way you look at it. And I've been over here for 11 years from New Zealand, and don't worry, I do a lot of counting in New Zealand dollars. And I've just bought a couple of horses from Europe, and we're looking at euros and pounds and everything, and the money's unbelievable. Of course, the form from the autumn already has stood up amazingly well with Nature Strip going to Ascot and running superbly. And it's going to be tough racing, no doubt about it. But I'd like to think if we can get a couple of our horses right on the day, we can at least get a part of that 30 million, and you don't need too much of it.
Just give me a smidge, baby. Bjorn Baker Racing. It's the proprietor, Bjorn Baker himself, on the Everest Connections. Let's delve into the Everest, which is the world's, not just Australia's, not just the hemispheres, it's the globe's richest turf race. And before we get specifically in the Everest, I want to ask you a question. Turf versus dirt. You guys have synthetic and natural tracks there at Warwick Farm. How do you go about prepping a horse for its entire career or just a race vis-a-vis the track surfaces you use in training in advance of any given race?
Yeah, it's been a tough one, and it's actually a very relevant question with all the wet weather we've had over the last 6 months. So, as opposed to probably Victorian racing and now New Zealand racing and even Hong Kong, we're predominantly, well, we're all grass. We only race on grass, and it's all right-handed and relatively tight tracks, with the exception of Randwick. So, with the wet weather we've had, we've got a great poly track here at Warwick Farm, which is amazing for day-to-day gallops in and out. But in terms, I like the old like for like. I like, if we're racing on Saturday on grass, I like to gallop them, for example, this morning on grass and give them a good hit out in terms of Saturday. So it has been challenging the last few months, and every track has its place, and I think every trainer has to take responsibility how they can best utilise their facilities, and thankfully at Warwick Farm they're extremely well maintained. We've got a lot of horses here, but I think in terms of Warwick Farm, the tracks are outstanding. Logistically, we're well placed in Sydney to travel north, south, east and west, and we've got a lot of races open to us in terms of travelling.
There's so much history in the sport of kings and horse racing. It's just about as old as biped human racing, where I say, hey, Bjorn, I can beat you to the tree and back. Now we're saying your horse can beat mine, or vice versa, to the tree and back. But your part of the world is so brand new. I'm out here in the American West, which is much newer than the American East. But doing my research, you went to the oldest university in New Zealand, which was founded in the second half of the 19th century, I think 1871. And there are some ancient horse races, but the Everest is very new. This is just the 6th iteration. And yet it's gaining prominence regionally and nationally. And of course, internationally, people are talking about it with the slots. What was your perspective on the Everest when it started, and where is it now?
Yeah, good question, AP. I think initially I was probably I might have been a little bit wary about the whole concept in terms of the slot concept and trying to get a horse good enough. But as time has gone on, it's the biggest day in Sydney racing. It really is. It gets a massive young crowd there. They have an international band after the last race. Now, these bands are very much sort of towards the younger generation. I've never heard of these people. Apparently they're very famous in hip hop, but it is a really young crowd, and they have taken to it immensely. So it's a great day's racing to be part of, and hopefully we can get a few runners on the day this year again.
And that's fascinating to me, because one of the generalities we look at in America about Australia is you guys put a different twist on something and innovate. The sport of kings can be viewed a little bit stodgy, a little bit blue-bloodish, and you just said something that's cool. The most exciting day in Sydney racing. You guys are already exciting, but it's risen to the top. How much pride collectively, not just in the horse racing community, but the entertainment and business community writ large in Sydney, do folks on the island continent take in having created this bad boy?
Yeah, well, and it's sort of racing's very much mainstream. You talk about probably in the US football and basketball and ice hockey. Well, racing is part of that. We've got rugby and cricket and rugby league and AFL. Horse racing's right up there with the best of them. It's part of society.
That's great.
People, in terms of Randwick's very close to the city. It's a nice part of Sydney. People want to live. The facilities there are as good as anywhere in the world, and the business community want to be involved. The Australian community as a whole want to be involved. The money's so good, and they just want to get there to a Randwick race meeting on a Saturday, because win, lose or draw, it's great to be part of.
Let's say you take a phone call from one of your dad's old associates there, and I'm going to say in Auckland. I'm making something up here. And this is a guy who's hit it big in the insurance business, and he wants to take a swing at horse racing, but he knows as much about horse racing as I do about 13th century Bulgarian poetry. And he says, Bjorn, in 2 years or less, I want a horse to really battle in the Everest, and I'm going to write whatever check you need. Who are you calling? What types of qualities are you looking for in that horse?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I guess that's what I want. And I've got a couple of big New Zealand owners, and funnily enough, a couple of them came to the races last year, Everest Day, and they said, this is the best event we've ever been to. This is unbelievable. And the day in itself is magic. So I guess really you've got to look more Australian. Australian sprinters are very good I think if you look at the Everest results too, you go off past records, and you just head to one of the English or Magic Million sales and look to get a precocious, fast, strong Aussie bred, and really hope and try and get something that can go. And as you know, there's only one rule with horses. There are no rules. So you better write us a few checks.
Man, you sound like the Outback Steakhouse, which of course I'm sure is totally Americanized, just the imported stuff they're selling us Australia here. No rules, just rights. No rules, just win, baby. Our guest on the Everest Connections is Bjorn Baker. Let's get back to a tactical question, though. And this one, I guess, I'm going to put your jockey silks on as well. Just 1,200 meters in the Everest, and you're the general, and I guess the jockey is the guy hitting the beach with his rifle if you want to do warfare, and you've got this great game plan. And all of a sudden in the first 50 meters, somebody takes off and sets a much faster pace than anybody expected. How tempting is it to try to match that, but how much trouble could you get into if you burn yourself out too early?
Yeah, and that's I guess there's only 12 runners, so you're going to have the 12 best riders in Sydney, and a lot of those guys and girls are really, you've just got to leave it up to them to do the best thing, and hopefully we're in a position where the jockey, if we get to that stage, will know the horse, and you'll just have to leave it up to them. But yeah, it's a tricky one. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about, getting your tactics right, and hopefully the race works out that way. Even now, of course, Nature Strip's a fierce competitor. He jumps and puts himself on speed, as does Eduardo. So you've got to have a really rock-hard, fit, tough superstar to really go with those sprinters.
Yeah, you just mentioned a couple of behemoths, but that's what makes it so fun. Everybody wants to knock off the best. I know you're a competitor, and all the other owners and jockeys and trainers are as well. Finally, I want to ask you something big picture about life. You were raised in a horse racing family and initially decided to go into the business world, but later the heartstrings, the emotion, the history, whatever it was, tugged you back in that direction. Give some advice to somebody. It doesn't have to be horse racing, but somebody who has gone in one direction. Maybe they're playing it safe, but they want to chase another dream. Maybe it's comedy. Maybe it's entrepreneurship. Maybe they want to start a digital magazine like my boss, Pallavi, but they're playing it safe as a banker or insurance or pharmacy, which are great careers. When did you know, hey, I've got to get out there and take that chance?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And all I'd say is you only have one crack at it, and make the most of it. When you have a go, you got to have a red hot go. And thankfully for me, it's worked out pretty well in Sydney, even though I'm going through a bit of a rut at the moment. So I've got my back against the wall and trying to iron out a lot of any issues we've got. And I think we'll do that successfully. But at the end of the day, you only get one chance at it, and you've got to make the most of it. And Australia's a great country for that. You can really have a crack. And like America too, if you're good enough, you get an opportunity, and everyone's in a position where they can have a crack.
Life is like a horse race, folks. When they open that gate, you got to run as fast as you can. A guy who's done a great job of it. He's going to get out of that rut really soon. Bjorn Baker from the eponymous Bjorn Baker Racing there in the island continent down under Australia. Really appreciate your time. Look forward to speaking to you again, and look forward to talking to you at, or very near at least, that winner's circle in the Everest. Thank you so much.
Thanks, AP.